if a judge is not upright, there's a lot that you can get away with, and there's very few limits and constraints, and so you can hold people as material witnesses indefinitely. So after 9/11, some people have been held as material witnesses without the government ever having to define what is it that they are material witnesses for 20 years. And but these issues are not. I mean, I am willing to concede that ISIS, that they did this as what they believed is an Islamic, as what they believe Islam obligates them to do, and I mean, even conceding all of that, the issue is, does this mean that we either have to fear Islam or Muslims? And I think that's really the crux of the matter. Because like the New York Post, its big front page headline was, Muslims kill 14 people and blah blah blah. Mm-hmm. Now, I imagine if you can just if this was committed by any other group, would you say blacks kill 14 whites in Detroit, or would you say Jews kill, whatever? And it's but you can do it with Muslims, and you can do it, and it doesn't raise an eyebrow. What's his face? That guy who wrote a book called "It Is Islam," and it was on the New York
Glenn
Times.
Beck from Fox. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, he wrote a book called "It Is About Islam," and it was a New York Times bestsellers list. And a lot of the stuff he says is not just simple religious bigotry and ignorant and racist, but you can only get away with it. The only group of people you can really get away with the stuff he's saying is, so there's just a lot of stuff in there about the prophet, the prophet Muhammad, the founder of Islam, was an evil man. So by definition, all those who believe in that faith are also evil.
By association.
And so, he says it's just pure logic. If he's evil and you follow his faith, then, evil can only beget evil. And stuff, just the book is full of stuff like that. But I mean, because we're getting there's just so much going around that we thought it would be helpful to try to do something.
Public service. And is it like when people talk about Islam, I mean, it's like very smart people who know nothing about Islam don't really know like how to process all of this. And so I was reaching out to a lot of my friends who are, just that. They're smart, they're caring, thinking people, and they know very little about this religion, and asking them, okay, what would you ask a Muslim scholar, to help you like understand and make sense of it and like lessen the fear. And that was really kind of the point.
There was a flood of questions.
Yeah, there were a flood of questions. So some of the questions that I had, for example, just in a very basic way, like, what does Islam say about this? Does the Muslim faith condone or encourage violence? What is the average Muslim in America concerned about? Are they really fueled with hatred for America? Can Islam and the United States coexist? Why do they seem so at odds? Is it a small percentage of Muslims who condemn the United States, or is it widespread? Is it true that, there's a video going around saying that, 15 to 20% of Muslims are radicalized or potentially radicalized? And this seems like a very high number. Is it really true? what is Sharia, what is Islamic law exactly, and how can people justify these kinds of actions, and then if it's true, like people understand that this is also the impact of Saudi Arabia and their very conservative strain of the religion, and it seems like people are going there to become radicalized, and if that's the case, then why don't Americans know this, and why isn't the government more open about that? Why are they our allies? And so that's like kind of a
there are a lot of questions on that. So I mean, other than questions we're sent, just feel free to ask whatever you want to ask, and just we'll do it until until the pain becomes unbearable, and then I'm gonna run away, which is not very long. And then I can take the Laura sleeping pill.
Yeah.
Did you end up bringing Coke, or did you forget?
oh, I forgot.
I'll get it. Right. So, do you
So I mean, did you have any questions or?
Well, some of those questions I mean, most of those questions, but I think it was either the first or the second. I think, well, I have very limited understanding of a lot of this stuff, but I'm just wondering what makes people, like, what part of the religion makes people, like, what part of the religion, like, who are the man that you were talking about, I don't even know what I'm talking about. The man that you said is evil.
The prophet.
Yeah, the prophet.
Yeah.
So, if you could explain that. I don't know. Like, is he the...
Yeah, I mean, it's like, I think people just don't, they don't even, most people don't know anything about Islam, and all they know is that, these crazy people who commit crazy things, and I don't think they even know the difference between, most people don't know that the difference between an Arab and a Muslim. They think they're pretty much the same thing, or, and they're not. And so anyway, my job is just to answer questions. I'm not to ask them. So I'm gonna shut up. Just wake me up when you have a question.
Oh, we know, but that was a question, right?
Well, what is the question?
The question, and just maybe to give
like a little
Seven.
background.
brief
Reader's
background
Yeah.
primer on.
Okay, so let's say the
I mean, if you're starting with someone who knows zero about Islam.
I thought you said, can you get cocoa? And I was like, why cocoa?
Why specifically cocoa?
Like, totally messed up. Look at the dog.
you're saturated with dogs. Wonder why. All right, so let's even start from what is Islam about? I mean, and then go from there to the second layer, and what about the teachings of Islam that can possibly fuel behavior, criminal behavior, like this incident. So the ABCs of the Islamic faith is that most people know about prophets like Moses and Joseph, and in the Islamic faith, Jesus is not considered God or or the whole creed of the Trinity is pretty much rejected. Jesus is considered a prophet of God, a very important prophet of God. Muslims believe in the Immaculate Conception. They believe that Mary was a virgin, but they do not believe that Jesus was divine, but was a prophet empowered by the Holy Ghost and so on and so forth. And the most important part to sort of the background of this faith is that the prophet Abraham had lines of descendants. There was Isaac, the descendants of Isaac, which are the Jewish people in part, and Ishmael, who in Christianity and Judaism has a very ambiguous position because of the story of his mother and so on. But the descendants of Ishmael were the people who inhabit today Arabia today, and in Islam is the insistence that all the descendants of Abraham had prophets. So there are many prophets from the line of Isaac and prophets from the line of Ishmael, and we get into more nuanced questions of other lines and so on. And the most critical part is that God sent prophet after prophet after prophet to humanity, and all these prophets carried the same basic message, that there's one God, monotheism, and that human beings are deputies or the caretakers on earth, that they were created by God, entrusted with the deputyship or the viceroyship or as agents over earth, and that the thing about human beings is that they were given, they come from the breath of God, or in Islamic theology, a Holy Ghost, or the Holy Ghost, Ruh al-Quds, is the breath of God, and that breath of God goes into all human beings, and so, and that human beings were given free will, and that this free will comes with obligations and duties and rights, so, and a whole system. So the laws of Moses are the same in Islam. Jesus is seen in the same dramatic fashion as a prophet, in that he was persecuted and that his people attempted to crucify him. Whether he was crucified or not is something that theologians debate. Most Muslims today believe he wasn't really crucified, that God saved him from the agony, but as a theologian I can tell you that that's a hotly debated issue, whether he was actually physically crucified or not. Spiritually crucified is a separate matter. Anyway, and then so we get to the Abrahamic prophets until God says, okay, well, that's it. Humanity has matured enough. I've sent enough prophets, enough messages. Past prophets used to have miracles to fascinate you guys, fascinate you human beings, impress the heck out of you, and get you to believe through these miraculous acts of walking on water and raising the dead, etc., etc. But now humanity has reached a level of rational maturity that now I'm giving you a book. There's also the Islamic belief that Moses came was a book, Jesus came was a book, and there were other divinely revealed books. So Muslims believe in the divine revelation other than the Quran, and that in the case of Muhammad, who was considered the final prophet, he's considered thoroughly human. That the what is binding and authoritative of what he brings is what God sent to him as revelation. But there are many other aspects in which he's just a human being, and so the Quranic text, for instance, talks very bluntly about this and says that Muhammad is just an immortal man who, like all other human beings, walks around in markets and does what other human beings do, but that only God is divine and eternal, and so on and so forth. And so there's this Quranic revelation which is considered to be the final revelation, the last word by God to humanity, and so that's the basic premise. And so you're a Muslim if you believe that there's only one God, and that's the God of Abraham, God of Adam, God of Abraham, God of Moses, God of Jesus, God of Joseph, God of all the prophets, and that God, his final prophet is Muhammad, and that this final prophet was the final testament, a book of teachings known as the Quran. Now, that's sort of the crux, the easy part. There's another further segment that you can say is the easy part, and these are called the pillars of Islam. So you believe in God, in Allah as the God of all the previous prophets, and that Muhammad is the final prophet. That you pray to God 5 times, either it's 5 prayers, whether they're performed 3 times a day or 5 times a day, but that you owe God prayers every day, that you fast during the month of Ramadan, and that you pay alms. A certain amount of your money goes to feeding the poor and taking care of the needy, and that finally that one time, for those who are able to do so, health-wise and financially, they go to Mecca for pilgrimage. And the Mecca is actually quite fascinating, because in Muslim belief, the genesis of the Kaaba, they believe that the Kaaba was initially, it's the sort of the founding stone of it was put by Abraham, and so it represents not just all the Abrahamic prophets until Muhammad, but the cosmos and what do you call this, circular movement of the cosmos, and that's why Muslims go around the Kaaba, or that stone structure that you often see in pictures, and then the symbolisms abound from there. But it would have been a fairly more straightforward story if the Prophet Muhammad died as a young man. Then if like Jesus, if he hung around for a few years teaching, preaching the word, and then was killed or whatnot, or God made him disappear, or abducted by aliens, whatever it is. If he just hung around for a couple of years and then disappeared, But what makes the complexity come in the case of Islam is that he lived for about, his prophecy started when he was 40 years old, and it lasted for 20 years. And the first 12 years, they were all preaching without the use of arms. There was no armed conflicts. But his preachings or his teachings in the city of Mecca, which exists till today, resulted in horrendous persecution of him and his followers. And so they migrated to a city called Medina, which exists today. And then the various tribes of Arabia, for a variety of reasons, went on a systematic campaign to try to snuff out this whole the existence of Muslims in Medina, and that leads to a series of armed confrontations, that all of which Muslims won. They won every battle except one, the second battle. And Islam, by the time the Prophet dies, had spread throughout Medina, but not much beyond Medina. Now, the Quranic text insists that it is a revelation to all humankind, that it is sent, as it were, to all humankind. So the companions and disciples of the Prophet, like the disciples of Jesus, although each of them, like the disciples of Jesus, have a different view of the character or the interpretation of the will of the Prophet. But what happened is that these disciples are effective in running political affairs for a fairly short period of time, beyond which Islam takes its own momentum. There's a political movement sort of jumps upon the Islamic, very much like the way Justinian adopts Christianity for the Roman Empire and goes on a rampage of in which it's spreading Christianity through the use of arms, and and that's how Christianity then becomes a world religion. And back then it was an empire called the Umayyad, and a series of rulers who, in the name of Islam, they create a vast empire and so on. Now, that's all not contested. And the Islamic civilization, all you have to do is just buy a book of art and titled, or even just a book called Islamic Civilization, and you'll see architecture, music, art, a lot of different things that trade, all the different things that were invented in the Islamic civilization, and while Europe was in its dark ages. So it was a multifaceted civilization, and was a very nuanced story. There is very much like, Muhammad, like Moses was also a prophet that didn't just preach, but ultimately resorted to arms. And like Judaism, there's this a huge juristic interpretive tradition. Basically experts in Islamic history and Quran and the tradition of the Prophet interpreting what all of this means. In the case of Islam, it's called Sharia. In the case of Judaism, the oral tradition is called the Talmud, and the interpreters are called the rabbis. The tradition is called the rabbinic tradition. So very much like the rabbinic tradition, there is the Sharia tradition, so the interpretation upon interpretation by these many jurists. The difference is that in Islam, a certain percentage of these interpretations grew from actual judicial practice, not just theory, but there was actual law practice in courts. Now, what parts of the law became a part of the Sharia tradition and what parts were left out, that's a very complicated question, and we go on endlessly about it. But so both of these traditions, and I mean, if the Catholic Church would not have gone through, if you pretend that the Catholic Church had not gone through the First Council of Nicaea and the Second Council of Nicaea and the Third Council of Nicaea and so on, the papal law would have become as huge as rabbinic law and as huge as Sharia law. Because papal law, even if you study it today, is still pretty complex. But because in Catholicism there is ultimately a central figure that could settle issues and say, okay, this is the law, all disagreeing opinions out the door. Well, in Judaism and Islam that didn't happen. There's no central authority. So while a scholar of Christianity who doesn't want to recognize papal authority would have their work cut out for them, because then they have to read all these interpretations upon interpretations upon interpretations, and then they become as a bookworm as much as a scholar of Judaism or a scholar of Islam, Islamic law or Jewish law. But in Islamic law there is never a centralized authority that answers theological questions definitively and definitively and exclusively. And so there were always several schools of thought, and it was sort of an evolving tradition. So you could point to certain doctrines as always having the majority opinion or even the overwhelming majority opinion on its side. But if you look hard enough, you'll always find minority views here and there, or sprung everywhere, and literally on everything. I mean, you can name the issue and I can tell you what the minority view was, or the minority views, which even complicates the case. At one time there were 500 different schools of law in Islam. Anyway, so, but what is in its essence, in its fundamental core, what does Islamic creed teach, is that you and only you are responsible for God for only your actions and no one else's. So you and this is all over the Quran, that you can't, in the final day, you can't come and say, well, my parents told me to do it, or my husband told me to do it, or so you bear responsibility for your own behavior, your own decisions, and so on. That God is just to perfection, so that God is incapable of being unjust. So God is not going to screw up and hold you at fault, when that God knows what's inside of you, God knows what you think, God knows what you, and that God is very compassionate and very merciful, and that God is very loving. And so that this God is also not going to be stickler and going out of their way, of God's way, to make you suffer. But at the same time, because this is a just God, God is not going to say, "Oh, you killed 10 people. Well, okay, no problem. I forgive it." It's not. That would be an unjust God. And that, moreover, that what humanity, as all of humanity is charged with, is to bring the beautiful attributes of divinity, because part of the Islamic theology is that God is beautiful and God loves beauty. So whatever is good and beautiful is what God also loves. You point, and that's why God creates beautiful things so we can understand beauty, contemplate beauty. But also God creates the opposite of beauty so we can look at, ugly, gross things, whatever they are, like animal refuse or human refuse, and say, well, that's how flowers smell, that's how poop smells. The contrast is educational. And the big charge is to recreate, or the big challenge to humanity is to recreate as much of the attributes of divinity on this earth. Now, in theory, Muslims are supposed to be at the forefront of this effort. Muslims are supposed to be, to bear witness. They're supposed to be so good at creating the attributes of divinity on earth that they bear witness for God. In reality, it doesn't work that way. And the Quran, basically tells Muslims, if you fail me, know that because you're Muslims, I will hold you more responsible than others who never had a chance to be Muslims. And so that, in school of theology, we spent a lot of time talking about that and thinking about that and debating that. And okay, so to what extent am I, as an individual, responsible for? It's only the normal, truth, honesty, honor your parents, love your neighbor. It's the normal moral laws with. If you've ever been in an Amish community and you look at their views on sexuality, and they don't want individuals to have sex before marriage, you can say that remains because they read the Bible in a certain way, and that remains predominantly the view in Islam, and and was and is and continues to be. Now, that doesn't mean that Muslims don't have extramarital sex. They're not supposed to. It's the difference between what you're supposed to do and what you actually do. So, people come to me and say, but I went on websites and I saw, Muslims posting all types of sex acts. Well, yeah, so what? Just because they call themselves Muslims, it doesn't mean that. And say, well, what's going to happen to them in the final day? I don't know. It's God's business. I'm going to worry about myself. I'm not going to worry about them. Especially that none of them ask me my opinion about what they're doing. So it's none of my business. Actually, I read something about like that. The consumption of pornography is like the second largest in Muslim countries. So it's the difference between theory and reality is just always. But did I leave anything out?
fundamental core message of Islam?
The fundamental core message is that one, I mean, God needs nothing from humanity. Nothing I do is actually going to add an asset to God. So it's not that I do anything. So everything that God teaches is for humanity's own good. Second is that by submitting to this God, I take a vow to submit to no one else but God. So you become fairly, I mean, in theory, if anyone should have been constantly in a state of rebellion against despots and dictators, it should be Muslims, because you should, by submitting to God, you should refuse to submit to the authority or the coercive authority of anyone else over you but God. And this act of submission to God is an act of empowering and dignity or dignification, by inventing a word, the adornment of dignity upon yourself as a human being, and then the beyond that is the Islamic greetings. You know, Muslims meet each other. They always say "Salam alaikum," which means peace be unto you. Is that okay? So if I submit to God and I submit to no one else, what is the net result of that? The net result is I should become in a state of peace. I should be able to exist peacefully within myself, peacefully within my family, peacefully within my neighborhood, peacefully within my world. Now, the ironies abound in the case of terrorist acts when you consider that these are sort of the fundamental teachings of Islam, and you know.
Yeah, so what part then can be, like, what makes
the logic used, and here, you know, invariably and without exception, the logic used by all groups that resort to arms. Now, whether that they resort to arms in situations that are arguably moral, or in situations that are arguably not moral. And invariably, the logic is we are defending ourselves. We are not attacking anyone, we're defending ourselves. So that it's not that we reject peace, the state of non-peace was forced upon us. All right. So then the next step beyond that. Okay, so can they, do they disagree with this fundamental theology of peace? Well, there are a fringe theologies that got the very bright idea that, well, yeah, Islam will achieve peace and should achieve peace, but it's after the whole world becomes Muslim, which is an idea contrary to what you read in Islamophobic books, contrary to, in schools of theology and law. You learn to what extent this idea has caused misery upon its followers. The idea that, you know, then you postpone peace forever because you're never going to attain peace. Then this notion that, well, yeah, we'll worry about peace once we get there, but then your generation after, and generation after, and generation after, and generation after will never get there. So it was and remains a marginal fanatic fringe.